Saluton, kiel vi fartas? Bonvenon al Scienceverse. Hold on, there's no need to change the language settings on YouTube. Everything is fine. That was just a greeting in another language. It is not an official language of any country. In fact, it's not even a natural language, so to speak. But I assure you it really exists. Stay until the end of the video, and you'll fully understand this story. Hey, Pedro here. This video you are watching was originally in Portuguese, my native language. This is the attempt of our team to translate it to English, and I sincerely hope you enjoy it. Your feedback is extremely important to us. Now, back to the video. But before we get there, I don't know if you've ever stopped to think about how everything would be much easier if the entire humanity spoke the same language. Communication between people all over the world would be much more practical and efficient. Why then doesn't this happen? After all, if human beings walk, jump, sleep, do so many things the same way, why doesn't everyone speak the same way too? The truth is that the first humans were already expressing themselves long before the emergence of any language. Non-verbal forms of communication have always existed among our ancestors. And even in other animals, like this dog here wagging its tail to show happiness. Leave a like for this cuteness. Whether with gestures or facial expressions capable of conveying ideas of fear, disgust, happiness, or sadness, human beings were already communicating long before words were invented. There were also drawings. The famous cave paintings allowed humans of the past to express themselves and leave behind small fragments of the history of our species. People, animals, nature, and even the first maps were immortalized on the walls of caves some tens of thousands of years ago. But what about speech? When did humans definitively differentiate themselves from other animals and begin to communicate through words and languages? For the biologist Charles Darwin, considered the most important name in the study of the evolution of species, our language emerged precisely from the imitation of animals. Still in the 19th century, Darwin wrote, "I cannot doubt that language owes its origin to the imitation and modification aided by signals and gestures from various natural sounds, the voices of other animals, and man's own instinctive cries." Other scientists point to different explanations for the emergence of verbal communication. For some researchers, the first sounds imitated not only animals, but also the human's own manual gestures. There are also those who say that it all started with interjections. Those sounds we make unintentionally, out of surprise, pleasure, or pain, for example. In other words, perhaps the first word in history was the ouch of a Neanderthal who stubbed his toe on the coffee table in the cave. Another theory suggests that verbal communication was born from collective work in an attempt to synchronize muscular effort. Like when you and your friends need to carry a heavy object together and say, 1, 2, 3, go. But without the words 1, 2, 3, and go, it's all based on grunts. Ultimately, it's possible that the correct answer is all of the above. In other words, humans didn't wake up one day communicating perfectly. Little by little, our language emerged through noises here and moans there. And then, over time, our vocal apparatus developed, allowing an increasingly wider range of sounds to come out of our mouths. And then humans gradually began naming each of the objects around them with different names and sounds. Moreover, at some point, human language underwent a unique change in the history of evolution, the ability to be creative with language. For example, the phrase Pedro Pineapple ended Yorkshire has probably never been said before. This kind of creativity is unprecedented in other animals. Animal language is straightforward. A dog wagging its tail is always a happy dog. Human language, on the other hand, has many more layers of complexity. The exact same sign can mean different things in different situations, for example, with different tones and inflections. Besides having language, humans also create language in different forms, such as signs, writing, or spoken language, a process that has given rise to more than 400,000 words that exist in Portuguese, my native language, alone, in addition to the millions of other words in thousands of languages around the world. This is the subject of study in a large field of knowledge called linguistics. Names like Ferdinand de Saussure, Mikhail Bakhtin, and Lev Vygotsky dedicated their lives to understanding and trying to explain how the systematization of human languages works. The first language known was the so-called Proto-Indo-European. It was the root of most of the languages spoken in the world today. And when I say root, it's because we can think of it exactly like a tree. The root grows and gives rise to the trunk, which in turn divides into a series of branches. And that's how it happened with our language. The Proto-Indo-European tree was not the only one in this forest of human communication, but it was certainly the one that grew the most and bore the most fruit. All these languages were born from that common root. In some cases, the exact location where Proto-Indo-European emerged is not known, but scientists believe it was roughly where Turkey is today. And then, as humans migrated around the world, languages also began to differentiate. Additionally, wars and land invasions also led to the proliferation of languages. For example, when the Romans conquered a region, they brought Latin with them. But at the same time, they also absorbed words from the local languages of the lands they occupied. And then, imagine this process happening all the time over thousands of years in various corners of the world. The result was the subdivision of that original first language into thousands of languages that are very different from each other. And there are literally thousands. There are about 7,000 different languages worldwide. In Brazil alone, there are more than 200. The vast majority are native languages, such as Guarani, Yanomami, Guajajara, and many others. And there are also communities that speak foreign languages, such as Pomeranian, which is similar to German, and is used especially in some cities in Espírito Santo and the south. In addition, of course, to Libras, the Brazilian Sign Language, which is one of the official languages of Brazil. And by the way, for those who don't know, each place has its own sign language. It is not universal. There are a few hundred around the world. But going back to spoken languages, just as it happens in Brazil, other countries have similar situations. That is, in most places, the majority of the population communicates in only one or two languages. And then much smaller groups speak a vast variety of languages, which exist even with few speakers. Putting this into numbers, we can say that 94% of the Earth's inhabitants speak only about 10% of the languages that exist. In other words, more than 90% of languages are spoken by only 6% of the world's population. If this information is impressive on one hand, on the other, it is concerning. After all, this means that a large part of humanity's cultural wealth only survives thanks to a very small portion of the population. In other words, over time, many of these languages may end up becoming extinct. In fact, this is actually quite common. On average, according to UNESCO, every 2 weeks a language ceases to exist on Earth, and I hope the next one isn't mine. At this rate, by the end of this century, half of those 7,000 languages I mentioned could simply disappear. And here it's worth differentiating the concept of an extinct language from another important concept, that of a dead language. The most famous example of a dead language is Latin. Latin still exists. Many people speak Latin. Priests pray in Latin. Harry Potter casts spells in Latin. But Latin is not anyone's native language. In other words, no one will intuitively learn Latin, as happens with Portuguese in Brazil, English in the United States, and so on. Especially because it is not the official language of any country. Or rather, to be precise, it actually is in the Vatican. But that's a very unique case. It's a country with less than 1,000 inhabitants and the size of a town square. The fact is that no human grows up hearing Latin in the family, at school, or on television. Everyone needs to stop to study the grammar and vocabulary if they want to know how to speak it. And this, of course, requires a lot of effort, a lot of time, and results in very few people being able to speak Latin fluently. If learning a new language is already laborious, imagine one that is spoken by very few people. This leads us to wonder, what if it wasn't necessary to learn multiple languages to communicate with everyone? After all, no matter how passionate you are about studying languages, it's impossible to speak all of them. But what if we tried to choose just one and turned it into a kind of universal language? Why has humanity never done this? Well, it wasn't for lack of trying. The most famous example is Esperanto, an artificial language conceived by the Polish Ludwig Zamenhof at the end of the 19th century. He lived in a city that belonged at the time to the Russian Empire, where several different languages were spoken. And that's why he wondered, what if there was a single language for all peoples? Zamenhof took Slavic phonemes, was inspired by Latin words, and imitated common structures in various languages, such as the adjective before the noun, which is typical in English. To facilitate learning, he used simple rules, such as only 3 verb tenses: past, present, and future. The result was the creation of the most important artificial language in the world. Today, Esperanto has almost 10 million people who can speak it with some minimum level of fluency. It is used in some international events, in internet broadcasts, in literature, in music, and it was also the language I used in that greeting at the beginning of this video. Additionally, Wikipedia alone has more than 350,000 articles in Esperanto nowadays. But Esperanto is not the only artificial language ever invented by humans. There are other similar projects, such as Noviel, Aido, and also Interlingua. The latter is called an auxiliary language because it is based on the existence of similar words in various languages around the world. And a good part of this vocabulary comes from Latin languages, but there are terms from other parts of the earth that are understood by many people. This is the case with words like kimono, igloo, and vodka, for example. And as a result, you can write texts like this one here, which is on the website of the Brazilian Union for Interlingua. I don't know if my Interlingua pronunciation is up to date, but I'll try. Le 900 millones de personas que parla portuguese, francese, espagnol, italiano, romaniano, etc. e mesmo le parlantes de inglese comprende un texto tecnic in interlingua sin studio previe. So, were you able to understand? It's an example of a text understandable to speakers of various different languages, even if they've never studied another language. But beyond this attempt at international communication, languages and other forms of artificial communication can be created for other reasons, including artistic ones. This is the case with Nadsat, invented by the writer Anthony Burgess for his book A Clockwork Orange. Anyone who has read this work or watched Stanley Kubrick's film should remember the language used by the droogs who left the Korova milk bar in the original, or in plain English, the thugs who gathered to beat people up around. And there's also Klingon, which is even more impressive. It's a fully structured language, even with its own grammar, developed by linguist Mark Okrand for the Star Trek series. There are books published in Klingon, annual events to promote the language, and even a case of an American father who spent the first 3 years of his son's life communicating only in Klingon, supposedly to understand how the language learning process works for children. How do you say crazy idea in Klingon? But neither Klingon nor Interlingua, not even Esperanto, were able to make the whole world speak the same language. It's because a language fabricated in a laboratory, so to speak, faces many difficulties in being incorporated into people's real lives. After all, remember when I mentioned Latin a little while ago? Just like a dead language, artificial languages are not official in any country, and they are not present in anyone's daily life. Okay, except for the rare child who heard their father speak Klingon for 3 years. But otherwise, we only have access to artificial languages if we stop to study and learn everything from scratch. And this process faces many barriers. The main one is access to education in the world. Just think, for example, of Brazilian schools. In many of them, students barely have enough Portuguese classes. A second language like English is even less common. It's no wonder that only 1% of our population is fluent in English. Imagine then the challenge of teaching an even less used language like Esperanto. Besides, we're talking about just one of over 200 countries in the world. This situation is even more delicate in other places. Most countries don't have much to gain by adopting another language in place of the languages of their population, especially when translation and lingua francas like English and French prove sufficient for international communication. And for this reason, as much as some of us would like it, the truth is that the whole world will hardly ever be able to understand each other in a single language. On one hand, this may seem like bad news to some people, but let's think about it from the other side. The great variety of languages that exist in the world is something fantastic. Just as different peoples have their laws, their religions, and even their calendars, they also have their languages. They are a fundamental part of the culture of each group and each nation. Studying new languages stimulates our brain and improves our memory. It also serves as a hobby for many people who enjoy learning a little more about the world through the language of each place. And it is also a practice that motivates many people to pack their bags and visit other countries in search of an immersive experience in a different reality. And even without traveling, it already serves to broaden our cultural repertoire. Watching a movie in another language or listening to a song in a different language, even if we don't fully understand the lyrics, are experiences that make us feel like we're traveling the world without leaving home. That's why it's not a problem if humanity never ends up speaking the same language. In the end, this can serve as an extra incentive for us to get to know the world. There are hundreds of countries, thousands of languages, millions of words, billions of people, and infinite reasons to be enchanted by this fascinating species that is the human being. Koran dankon, kaj gislavenon tan fojon.